Ryujin is the dragon king of the sea in Japanese mythology, ruler of an underwater palace called Ryugujo, built entirely from red and white coral, where time moves at a different rate than on the surface world. He controls the tides using two magical jewels, one that pulls the tide in and one that pushes it back out, making him one of the most practically powerful deities in the entire tradition, because in a seafaring island nation, the tides determine everything. His palace is filled with treasure accumulated over countless centuries, and his daughters are among the most beautiful beings in any realm. The fisherman Orochi was invited there as a guest, stayed what felt like 3 days, and returned to find 300 years had passed on shore. Ryujin appears in Japan's founding mythology as the grandfather of the first emperor, connecting the imperial bloodline directly to the bottom of the ocean. Kappa are water creatures from Japanese folklore, found in rivers, lakes, and ponds across the entire country, and they are one of the most detailed supernatural beings ever described in any tradition, because generations of rural communities built up an extraordinarily specific picture of exactly what they look like and exactly how to survive encountering one. They are roughly the size of a child, covered in greenish, scaly skin, with a beak like a turtle, a shell on their back, and a dish-shaped hollow on the top of their head filled with water that is the direct source of their enormous strength. If that water spills, the Kappa is temporarily powerless. This is why bowing deeply when you meet one works, because the Kappa is bound by Japanese social custom to bow back, and when it does, the water tips out. They drag people and horses underwater, but they also honor agreements absolutely, which makes them dangerous neighbors and surprisingly reliable ones. Umibozu is one of the most feared sea spirits in Japanese maritime folklore, appearing as an enormous shadowy figure rising from completely calm water without warning, its body dark as ink, and its shape vaguely humanoid, but vast enough to dwarf any ship. Sailors dreaded calm nights most, because that is when Umibozu appears, when there is no wind and no sound, and the sea is flat and black as a mirror. It does not attack immediately. It speaks first, asking for a barrel, and if you give it one, it fills the barrel with seawater and pours it over your deck until the ship sinks. The only way to survive is to give it a barrel with no bottom, which lets the water pour straight through endlessly without filling anything, and the Umibozu, apparently unable to understand the trick, continues pouring until dawn drives it back down. The sea being defeated by a bottomless bucket is one of mythology's quietest victories. Watatsumi is the divine ruler of the sea in ancient Japanese mythology, older than Ryujin in the earliest texts, and sometimes considered the same being under a different name, depending on which tradition you follow. He appears in the Kojiki, Japan's oldest chronicle, as the sovereign of an underwater realm filled with palaces and divine fish who serve as his court. His most important mythological moment involves the hunter god Huri, who borrowed his brother's fishing hook, lost it in the sea, and descended to Watatsumi's kingdom to retrieve it. There he met and married Watatsumi's daughter, Toyotama-hime, stayed for 3 years without realizing time was passing, and returned to the surface with magic jewels that gave him control over the tides. His children, through Toyotama-hime, became the ancestors of the Japanese imperial line, making Watatsumi as foundational to Japanese divine genealogy as any deity in the heavenly realm above. Isonade is a massive sea creature from Japanese coastal folklore, described as an enormous fish, some accounts say shark-like, whose most distinctive feature is not its size, but its tail, covered in backward-facing hooks that catch on anything they brush against and drag it silently beneath the surface. Fishermen and sailors feared it specifically because it gave no warning. There was no roar, no enormous wave, no visible approach. A man would simply be there one moment and gone the next, his boat rocking slightly from the disturbance of something enormous passing just beneath the hull. It lives in the waters around Kyushu and the western coastal regions, and sightings in folk accounts describe it as capable of capsizing large vessels with a single pass of its hooked tail. It represents the particular terror of the open sea that has nothing to do with storms or visible danger, the fear of something vast and patient moving through the darkness directly below where you are standing. Yamata no Orochi is the eight-headed, eight-tailed serpent of Japanese mythology, and its scale makes every other creature on this list seem modest by comparison. Each of its 8 heads and 8 tails stretched across 8 valleys and 8 mountain peaks simultaneously, its body so enormous that moss and trees grew on its back as if it were a landscape rather than a living creature. It demanded a young woman as sacrifice every year for 8 consecutive years from a grieving family the storm god Susanoo encountered after his banishment from heaven. Susanoo defeated it not through combat, but through patience and sake, brewing 8 vats of the strongest rice wine available, setting them out in 8 bowls, and waiting for each head to drink its fill and fall unconscious before attacking with his sword. Inside one of its tails, he found the legendary sword Kusanagi, which became one of Japan's 3 imperial treasures, meaning the foundation of imperial power came from inside a drunk monster. Ningyo is the Japanese mermaid, but the comparison to Western mermaids undersells how genuinely unsettling the Japanese version is. A Ningyo has the body of a fish and the face of a human, sometimes described as monkey-like rather than beautiful, and eating its flesh grants immortality, which sounds like a gift until the mythology explains the details. A person who eats Ningyo flesh will live forever, but everyone they love will age and die around them, and they will watch every generation they belong to disappear while they remain unchanged. The legend of Yaobikuni tells of a woman who ate Ningyo flesh accidentally, lived for 800 years, watched her family and friends die across centuries, and finally became a Buddhist nun seeking enough spiritual merit to be allowed to die. She is said to have achieved it eventually. The creature that grants eternal life is in Japanese tradition not a blessing, but one of the most precise descriptions of what immortality actually costs. Kohata Koheiji is a ghost from Japanese folklore specifically associated with water, one of the famous Hyakumonogatari Kaidankai ghost stories. The spirit of a man drowned by his wife and her lover, who returns from the water not to seek dramatic revenge, but simply to appear. He climbs from rivers and ponds and stands in rooms at night, dripping, watching. His face the pale greenish color of someone who has been underwater too long. What makes him genuinely disturbing in the Japanese horror tradition is not violence, but presence. He does not threaten. He does not speak. He simply arrives and stands there, looking at the people who killed him, and the psychological weight of that unblinking wet attention was considered more terrifying than any physical harm he could cause. He represents the specific Japanese understanding of vengeful spirits, that the dead do not need to do anything to destroy the living. They only need to be seen. Akashi is a broad category of sea spirit in Japanese folklore, but in its most specific usage refers to a particular type of enormous sea monster that appears around ships during storms, its body stretching across the water surface in multiple sections visible between the waves. Never fully seen, never clearly shaped. Sailors encountering one were said to be doomed not through attack, but through delay, because the Akashi would wrap around a ship and hold it stationary until the crew, unable to move or escape, bailed water continuously to keep the vessel afloat. The only way to survive was to bail faster than the creature expected, working through the night without stopping, which, in some folk accounts, would eventually cause the creature to lose interest and release the ship at dawn. It gave fishermen one of their oldest sayings about the sea, that the ocean never stops and neither can you, which is practical advice regardless of whether the thing holding your ship is supernatural or meteorological. Umibozu no Ko are the children of the Umibozu in Japanese regional folklore, smaller, shadowy sea spirits that appear in shallow coastal waters rather than the deep ocean their parent inhabits. Where the great Umibozu rises from the depths without warning, its children are said to gather near fishing villages on moonless nights, visible as dark shapes just below the surface that mimic the movements of fish to lure nets down before capsizing small boats from below. Coastal communities in certain regions of Japan maintain specific rituals before launching any boat at night, calling out particular words across the water as a form of acknowledgement. Not prayer exactly, but recognition. A signal that the fishermen knew the water was occupied and were not claiming it ignorantly. The idea embedded in these rituals is one of the most consistent in Japanese supernatural tradition, that the natural world is inhabited at every depth, and that the correct relationship with it is awareness rather than either worship or dismissal. Toyotama-hime is the daughter of the sea god Watatsumi, one of the most important divine women in all of Japanese mythology, and her story contains one of the tradition's most quietly devastating moments. She married the hunter god Huri, lived with him in her father's underwater kingdom, and when she came to the surface to give birth to their child, she asked him one thing: do not look at her during the birth. He looked. What he saw was his wife in her true form, a great sea dragon, or shark, depending on the version, the divine creature beneath the human appearance she wore in his company. She left immediately, returned to the sea permanently, and sent her younger sister to raise the child instead, which the younger sister did, and then married the child when he grew up, continuing the divine lineage in the way Japanese founding mythology required. Toyotama-hime built a wall of reeds between the sea and the land that has never come down. The ocean and the shore remember that look. Funa Yūrei are the ghosts of people who drowned at sea in Japanese folklore, and they travel in groups, which makes them different from most Japanese water spirits who operate alone. They appear to ships during storms as pale figures in the water, reaching up with their arms, and what they want is a hishaku, a ladle, because with a ladle they can scoop water into your hull and sink you down to join them. The correct response, according to maritime folk tradition, is to give them a ladle with the bottom cut out, the same solution offered to the Umibozu, which suggests Japanese coastal communities developed a specific category of bottomless container emergency preparedness. They are not malicious in the way demons are malicious. They are lonely in the way the drowned are lonely, pulling toward them the only company they understand, which is anyone still living on the water above them. The sea in Japanese folklore is full of the people the sea has already taken. Mizuchi is an ancient water dragon from Japanese mythology, appearing in the Nihon Shoki, one of Japan's oldest chronicles, as a poisonous serpentine creature living in river pools whose breath killed anyone who passed through its territory. It is one of the few creatures in Japanese mythology defeated through a direct challenge rather than trickery. A man named Agatamori threw 3 calabashes into the water and declared that if the Mizuchi was truly divine, it should sink them, and if it could not, it was merely a monster and he would kill it. The calabashes floated. He killed it. Its blood turned the river red for a considerable distance downstream, suggesting its size was not modest. The Mizuchi belongs to an older layer of Japanese mythology than most of the creatures on this list, before Chinese dragon iconography fully absorbed the native serpent traditions, a time when the things living in rivers were not majestic and wise, but simply enormous and hostile, and needed to be dealt with directly. Shashihoko is a mythological sea creature in Japanese tradition with the head of a tiger and the body of a carp, always depicted with its tail arching dramatically upward, and it appears not in horror stories, but on top of the most important castles in Japanese history as a protective ornament. The famous golden Shashihoko on Nagoya Castle are among the most recognized symbols in all of Japanese architecture. The creature was believed to be able to summon rain and control water, making it a natural guardian against fire for wooden structures, which in castle architecture was the most catastrophic possible threat. It exists at an interesting boundary in Japanese supernatural tradition. Not a god, not exactly a monster, more of a principle given animal form. The idea that water and fire are in permanent negotiation, and that placing the right figure between them maintains the balance. The tigers on Japan's greatest castles are fish, and the fish control the rain, and that arrangement has protected those buildings for 400 years. Kaiou is the sea dragon of Japanese folklore, distinct from the Chinese long dragon that heavily influenced later Japanese dragon iconography. A creature described in older coastal traditions as living in the deepest trenches of the Pacific, enormous beyond measurement, older than the islands themselves. Fishermen in certain regions believed the islands of Japan were not geological formations, but the sleeping bodies of ancient Kaiou, which meant the ground they built their houses on was the scaled back of something that had not moved in 10,000 years, but was not dead. Earthquakes were sometimes attributed not to tectonic activity, which was not a concept available to them, but to the Kaiou shifting slightly in its sleep, adjusting its position the way any large creature does without waking fully. The mythology contains no story of anyone defeating it, no hero who found its weakness, no ritual that controlled it. Some things in the ocean are simply older than the idea of defeating them, and the tradition had the honesty to say so.